Ontario, more than 90% of privately owned land is owned by residents, homeowners. We own the vast majority of the privately owned land. And that means that any plan for making our cities more sustainable must include the home gardener. We need homeowners to garden sustainably. And right now, the number one form of gardening in Ontario is probably still the lawn, which is not a sustainable form of gardening. So today, we're going to talk about what sustainable garden is, set a definition for it, and tie it into the concept of succession. Usually, when somebody says that they're talking about sustainability in a system, they are often talking about a system that can stay stable over time, that you continuously be able to do something for generations on end. So for example, sustainable forestry means that whatever the forestry practices are, that you can consistently do that for generations upon generation, and that the forest would continue to provide you with the services that you are seeking from it. In gardening, though, we're going to have to shift this definition. No matter how stable the practices are for a garden, if you walked away from that garden, it would not stay the same. In fact, even while you garden, the garden would not stay the same. Gardens are simply not stable. They change. They change continuously, and they change kind of predictably in many ways because of the process of succession. To understand what succession is, we're going to take a look at my side garden. And I put that in quotation marks because by side garden, I mean that strip of land at the side of my house that I have not actually gardened. What I did with that piece of land is that when we had the house renovated, the area in that land in that area was the weeds and the debris, etc., from the renovations was just ripped off the surface. And then we put a landscape fabric down, which, by the way, I do not recommend. Of all the ways to suppress weeds, I do not recommend the use of landscape fabrics, which we will get to the reasoning for that in another video. But that's what we did. So we put down the landscape fabrics, there was some mulch put on top, there was some dirt and then mulch put on top. And then I plopped in some really cheap plants that I had, nothing special. And it was just to hold the soil, and I chose plants that I thought that would be able to sustain themselves with very little to no care, and that would even probably spread and reproduce on their own. And I walked away while I dealt with the rest of the garden. And my hope is that next year I will start to garden on that side garden. So we're going to go look at that side garden to see what happened, because that side garden illustrates the process of succession beautifully. So this is the side of my house. It's a side garden. It's a strip between two houses. It doesn't get a lot of light. It gets some partial sun, partial shade, more shade than sun. When we look at it, we'll notice that it doesn't have a lot of variety of plants. What we have is a ton of, I believe, violets. They don't flower very often, but they are violets. I did not plant any violets, and yet they are. You can see some irises that I plopped in, but mostly you see a field of violets. We can see a rose bush that I did plop in, and we can see some echinaceas. I hadn't planted any echinaceas in this area. I planted some echinaceas towards the back of the house, but as you can see, there are a large number of echinaceas in here too. And there's another rose bush. So what we see is that, I'm going to walk a little forward. Most of the plants that I have planted have actually gone away. There's some, I think it's periwinkle there. Most of the plants that I planted are actually not here anymore. There are some of them. Some of them have stayed. Some of them have even spread. And there's an awful lot of new plants in here that I hadn't planted. And they are dominating the environment. So what happened and why did it happen? Natural ecosystems are composed of two key sets of ingredients, as it were. They're the living components of the ecosystem, also known as the abiotic factors of the ecosystem. And then there's the living components, the biotic factors. The thing is that living things require a certain environment to strive and to live in. So whatever can live in an area is dictated by the abiotic factors. The problem, though, or the thing about ecosystems, is that biotic factors, living things, change the environment when they live in it. By extracting resources, by dying and decomposing in the environment, by photosynthesizing, by producing chemicals, These living things alter the non-living components of the environment. And so, even though an ecosystem might start with a certain community of organisms, that community changes the ecosystem, changes the landscape, changes the chemicals of the environment. And by doing so, they change what kind of organisms can strive and live there. So over time, the community shifts because the biotic systems, the biotic factors, are changing and altering the abiotic factors. And so over time, the non-living components change. That causes the changes in the community that you see, and that community continues to change, and it goes on and on and on in a cycle. When an ecosystem starts, it usually starts from bare rock. And not very many things can live in bare rock, but there are a few. We'll take a look at one of the things that can live in bare rock. If we look at the driveway on near the other side of my house, we can see that in between the cracks, there's moss growing. That moss is able to grow on the crack even though there's no soil there. There's just a little bit more moisture in the cracks is what it is. Every time it rains, which it is today, there's going to be more moisture trapped in the crevices. And just enough moisture is all that a moss is going to need. There are plants that are rootless. There are no roots on those plants. They live on the surfaces. Those are your moss and your lichens primarily. And those organisms can live where there is no soil. We're going to take a closer look at some moss. Okay, so here we have a patch of moss that I pulled out from behind some plants. If you look at it, it looks like a plant. It's got the green leafy bits on it. If I turn it upside down, there we go. You can see that there's some brown patches on the bottom. Those are not roots. What they are is it's just more moss underneath that's died. As the moss grows, the bottom dies and it just keeps growing from its tips. It's all leafy bits, in other words. There are no roots. And why would it have roots? It doesn't grow in soil. It grows directly on the rocks. These sorts of organisms are the type of organisms that first usually adapt to a newly opened system of rocks that are now available, like after a glacier recedes or what have you. These are the first sorts of types of organisms that will establish themselves. But these organisms, by living on the rock, produce chemicals, often many of them acidic, which weather the rock and degrade the rock and cause the rock to break up into smaller and smaller particles. And of course, as the moss dies, like the bottom bits there where it's brown, this dead moss becomes organic matter that mixes with the rock. And so over time, soil is built. Soil is broken down rock and dead, decomposed organic matter, plus living microorganisms in it. Once soil develops in an ecosystem, any type of rooted plant can take hold of the ecosystem. But the question is, how much soil is there? Grasses, etc., can live on very little soil. So after the mosses, usually as the soil builds, grasses will start to take hold of the ecosystem. Their seeds blow in on the wind, they take hold. As the grasses die, they help to add organic matter to the system and you build the soil layer. Once that happens, then you have things like flowers and shrubs moving in. And finally, of course, you have trees. And so what that means is that ecosystems tend to go through a process where the soil builds over time and becomes more complex and nutrient rich. And the plants get bigger and more diverse with time. And there's a shift from no root organisms to shallow root organisms to deep rooted organisms that live longer, etc. So if you walk away from a garden, it will continue to go through this process. The landscape will continue to be altered. New organisms will blow in and they will take in and they will take hold and they will grow. Some organisms are more competitive than other organisms. So over time, what will happen is that the more competitive species will dominate the ecosystem. Eventually, Over time, an ecosystem reaches a stability point where only the most competitive species can keep it standing. New things can't come in very easily because it's so dominated by the high competitive species. And so the change becomes very slow, and you don't see a lot of changes in the community. That's like your old growth forest when that happens. And the only time an old growth forest goes through a major change is when a natural disaster like a forest fire or a tornado tears through it, which then rips out the species that are there. But key and important difference though is that while it might rip out the organisms, the soil is still there. And because there's soil, succession will happen again. New species will come in, but they will do it faster. It's not like starting from bare rock. So succession has two types. Primary succession is when you have to start from bare rock, and you need things like mosses, etc., to slowly, over hundreds of years, break down that rock. But if there's soil in an ecosystem, it is very easy for succession to restart and to bring back the trees, etc. And that's good news, because it means that of everything in our ecosystem, the most important thing in the ecosystem when it comes to restoring an ecosystem is the soil. And so the first thing to remember about sustainable gardening is that your soil is the base. The soil is the most important component of that ecosystem, and you must protect it and you must nurture it. Sustainable gardens then are not about unchanging gardens. They're about gardens that we will define in three ways. They are gardens where the quality of the soil is going to be maintained, and so the gardener does not need to continuously add nutrients in large quantities or moisture or import value into the ecosystem continuously in order to allow things to grow. It will have a very rich and nutrient-filled soil, and that soil value will be maintained over time. The second component of a sustainable garden is that it will have a high level of biodiversity. Now, why this is, we will talk about in another video, but biodiversity is a key component of sustainable ecosystems, and it is a key component about sustainable gardens. And the final parameter that we need to have to consider a garden to be sustainable is that it must work with the surrounding natural ecosystems. If my garden is a sustainable garden, it does not cause damage to the surrounding ecosystems, nor does it act as a serious barrier to natural ecosystems. This garden, if it's sustainable, instead would act as a corridor that connects one natural ecosystem to another. So if it were a sustainable garden, I would see evidence of that in the form of the organisms that transverse this garden. The birds would transverse it. The rabbits, the gophers, even the turkeys, believe it or not, transverse this garden. And that is what tells me it is sustainable. Now, I don't necessarily want every animal walking through my garden. I would prefer rats don't, for example. And there are things we can do to decide, can we control which organisms are going through or not? But whatever control mechanism I use, I would like it to not cause destruction, that gene flow from one part of a natural ecosystem to another part, from the ravine to a patch somewhere off, where there's a bit of a reserve, that the organisms can go through it is what we would like to see. So the three principles of sustainable gardening is maintaining quality soil that is maintained over time, keeping a high biodiversity that can be sustained over time. So not that the community doesn't change, but high biodiversity is sustained. And finally, that the ecosystem works with the environment it is in so that organisms can transverse it. If we do those three things, we have ourselves a sustainable garden. And we'll talk about what makes these different parameters sustainable over time. But I'd like to leave you with one more thing about sustainable gardening and succession. In order for a garden to be sustainable, we are going to have to work with the fact that succession happens, and yet we want to have a certain kind of garden and maintain it. So what does the gardener do? The primary job of a gardener in a sustainable garden is two things: to choose the appropriate organisms. We get to choose what that community is, and we need to make choices that will allow the organisms that we have chosen to flourish within this garden, and that they can flourish over time, and that they can do the things we want it to do, whether it's to give us food, whether it's to give us flowers, whatever it is we're looking for, that these organisms can do that. And two, we have to manage competition, because a key factor that drives the succession is competition. Organisms competing with each other for the space and the resources that are there. New organisms come in and they compete for the space. Existing organisms are there and they're going to compete for the space. A key component of gardening is in fact limiting competition and encouraging cooperation between your species. How we do that is something we will examine through a myriad of factors over time, of strategies, I should say, over time. And I hope you enjoyed this lesson on succession. See you later.